Hi, my name is Eliza and welcome to my YouTube channel. As you can probably tell by the title of this video, I bought a van. For those who don't know me, I have a chronic illness and a lot of my time I have been spending any sort of energy that I have on this van. It has taken a long time to get to the current point where I'm at just because it takes me forever to do anything. But I thought that now that I've gotten the flooring done, I would let you guys take a look at my van and finally show you the whole process. Traveling in a camper van is something that I've been thinking about doing for a very long time. And so in November of 2022, I bought this van. I bought a van today. It had to have a couple of repairs. So it did take quite a long time to fix those things up and just kind of get it prepped and ready before even starting to think about renovating the interior. It did come fully built out, which was amazing, but unfortunately the previous owner was a smoker, so it made the inside just really not enjoyable to be in. So I immediately stripped out the entire interior. The original layout of this van wasn't that far off what I originally wanted it to look like anyways, but it just was very worn down and I kind of wanted it to suit myself better, so I figured I would start from the top and obviously strip it all out. This van did originally come with 2 air vents. Now these air vents were not like linked up to any sort of electricity. It would just move around some air if there was any wind outside. My eventual hope is to be able to move my cat in here with me and travel with him. I did want to make this a really safe environment for him, so I did want to have as much airflow as possible. So I did buy 2 max air vents and I did install them by myself, but unfortunately I didn't record any of the installation. This was just at a time where I just wanted to get things done and I didn't really bother recording it. I did follow a specific YouTube video. I will link it down below, but this YouTuber is extremely helpful when it comes to van renovations, or at least it was helpful for me. Right now I have basically finished the entire floor and I have started working on the structural stuff for the walls and also the electrical system, but obviously by the title of this video it's just basically the flooring and what I've done up to now. I'll show you what it looks like. The floor is really beautiful. It has a nice little vinyl on top. This is hopefully to help no water damage, but before getting to this stage we had to do a lot of work. So the first thing that we did was, as I said, we prepped the entire interior. That was getting rid of random screws, sanding down or like wire brushing down little rust areas, painting over it. We had to plug a couple of holes in the floor. We also had to check that there were no leaks in the roof, so we just got a hose and sprayed down the entire exterior, and that was a bunch of fun. And with that information we dealt with those areas that would leak with some silicone, and that just means that there will be no leakages later in life. As I said before, we gave everything a wipe down and we also painted everything. This was with some rust preventative paint. This hopefully will stop any rust occurring. Unfortunately, the majority of this footage of the preparation of the van was done on my phone, so I've decided that if you want to watch an extra video of just the prep work on this van before the installation of the floor, which is obviously this video, then you can check it out on my Patreon. So now with a blank canvas we could start buying stuff for the floor. As I said before, I based a lot of my van build off this YouTuber. If you do need a little bit more information, you can check out those videos below because they were definitely super helpful. So the list of things that I needed were some pine slats. This was so that I could have some studs to eventually drill the rest of the flooring into. My measurements were 20 by 12 millimeters. So if you have your own van, you just want to measure out how thick those little ridges are so that you can place them in between them. Another thing that I needed was foam board insulation, and I needed it to be flat. I also needed a plywood flooring for the main base of the floor, and then my vinyl. I had some adhesive. So this was adhesive to stick the studs down onto the floor, the metal floor of the van. I also needed screws. These had to be countersunk screws. I also had vinyl adhesive. I also had wood filler. I also had some foam filler. And then the equipment I used was a sander and a jigsaw. So with my fresh canvas of a van, I was ready to get the floor started. So the first step were these slats. I needed to cut every slat to the right length so that they could be suitable studs. This was really easy, just a matter of measuring, cutting, and comparing and making sure I did everything right, and just laying that all down. And then once all of those measurements were down, I theoretically was ready to stick all of that down to the floor of the van. I personally didn't do that straight away because the idea is that you want to put as much weight on those studs as possible and just like have it really evenly spread. And unfortunately, a lot of my studs were a little bit warped, so I really needed that weight to just be evenly distributed. So I managed to solve that problem by cutting out my plywood, and that just meant that I could put that plywood on top and then put heavier stuff on top of it, and then it would just evenly distribute to all of those studs and make sure that the glue is really set. This cutting of this plywood was so difficult. I'm doing most of this alone, but I did have a lot of help with this just because it was so incredibly frustrating and heavy. It was too much. So basically I got 2 plywood sheets and I had to cut them into 3 different individual pieces. Sometimes you're lucky you get like a pre-made shape of the floor of the van with like tarp or carpet or something. Unfortunately, because mine was already a renovated van, I didn't have that. So to make sure that I got the right shape, I had to make a little cutout with some cardboard. This was pretty easy. You just can get some free cardboard from a recycling place or Bunnings, and I just taped a bunch of those boxes together and we went around with a Stanley knife and just made it to the shape of the van. Somehow, while recording this video, I forgot to talk about a really essential part to this build project, so I'll talk about it now as a voiceover. But after creating this outline with the cardboard, I had to obviously implement that into the plywood. So I started off by measuring out the 2 bits of plywood that I had and cutting one of these pieces of plywood into 2 separate smaller pieces so that it could easily fit the shape that I needed it to be. Obviously, the configuration of these plywood boards are different depending on what van you have, so you just make sure you measure out what you have. Also, make sure that you take advantage of the straight edges that you have on this plywood. I didn't, which is stupid in the long run, but it's good to learn from it. After having all of these 3 pieces cut out beautifully, I set them up in the configuration that they needed to be in. And here's me testing out where I lie down when it's in the van. This is really funny to me because I didn't realize I did this when I was recording it, but because I have a chronic illness that gives me major chronic fatigue, I just have several minutes of footage of me just napping on the floor just because I'm so exhausted after doing all this building stuff. Now moving on from that, I laid the cardboard outline on top of the 3 plywood pieces and just went around with a pencil to outline what it should look like. Then with my trusty jigsaw, I was able to go around the outline that I made and cut them into the appropriate pieces. Just to address something before anyone starts to comment anything, I am not a professional. I'm making this up as I go. I'm going off only YouTube videos and I have a lot to learn. I know that I'm not using all of the safety precautions that I could be using. I know I'm probably using tools wrong and doing things wrong, but this is just a learning process for me. So try not to be so harsh when judging my skills. The outline of the cardboard was not perfect in any way, so this then meant that the plywood was not perfect. So when I started putting all of these pieces into the van, I did have to do a lot of adjusting, which was very frustrating in the end. But ultimately I did get it done, and with that shape I also managed to cut out my foam board insulation. I again had 2 sheets of this foam board insulation, but I had to cut it out into 3 sections because that's just how the measurements ended up. I didn't do the exact 3 shapes that I did originally for the plywood floor because I didn't want to have any like seams lining up and then like if you step on it, it kind of like goes down. I don't know if that makes sense, but I wanted to make sure that it would be as smooth as possible if you were to walk on it. This ultimately did not work out, but I'll explain that later. So now with my cut out plywood floor, I was able to stick the studs down. I did this with my housemate. I'm very appreciative of her. So we used the adhesive, it was just a general adhesive, I'm pretty sure, to stick those studs to the floor. And then we put the plywood on top of those studs, and then I put a bunch of heavy stuff on top of that. Then the next step was putting the insulation down, sticking the plywood down onto the foam board. So then I started with a caulking gun adhesive, and then I went over that with some screws. So this is something that I had to prep a lot beforehand. Using my cardboard, I had to mark down where every stud was, and then that meant that I could easily put these screws in so that they could screw into the studs. So this is where my problem was. I originally measured how long I needed these screws to be based on some measurements that I got from this YouTube video. And I was like, okay, I'm just gonna do everything exactly like this dude says so that it's not confusing for me and so that it actually works, because I know it will work for this dude, so it must work for me. So I got everything I needed. But one thing that I didn't take into account is I think the foam board insulation was just a little thicker than I had planned for it to be. So that meant that the screws weren't long enough to get into the studs. So the floor isn't even. And it's not the end of the world, but next time that is something that I will take into account, and it is something that I'm taking into account now that I'm buying more screws. I need to make sure that I get the right sizes. Another problem that I came across is that I had countersunk screws, which means that it will sink into the plyboard, but I didn't have a countersunk drill head, and the screws just weren't going down enough. They weren't being flush with the plyboard. And the reason why that's important is because then the next layer to that is the vinyl, and I did eventually make it work. So I just had to pre-drill every hole. Yes, it was a good one. Do I want more? Yes, it was a learning process, but we got there in the end. So after this, the next step is to use some wood filler. Before that, I need to sand down all of the little screw areas. So I get this wood filler and fill in all those holes where the screws were. This is just to, again, make it a flat surface. This is when I noticed that the screws had obviously not stuck into the studs. And after using this wood filler, I also used a foam filler. This was just to go around all of the edges of the van so that if any water gets into it, it obviously won't get into the actual flooring of the van. There won't be any water damage. So I put a little bit of masking tape around the side just so that I wouldn't damage the van with the Stanley knife afterwards when I cut the foam filler, but it was just a matter of spraying around the edges and letting that set. I also sanded down the wood filler. So once that was done, that almost meant that I was ready to do my vinyl on top. I just had a couple of things to do before doing that. The first thing that I needed to consider were my stairs. So I did the same thing that I did with the floor for the stairs, which was getting a piece of cardboard, cutting out the right sizes, and then transferring that onto a plywood board, the spare plywood board pieces that I had, and the spare foam board insulation that I had. This part was a little bit fiddly because it wasn't just straightforward, and on top of that I wanted to make little hinges so I could get into the little areas where there could be little secret compartments. So it was a little bit fiddly, but I think ultimately I did a great job in the end. The one thing that I didn't do with the stairs is have any studs. I just basically stuck everything to the floor with adhesive. So I stuck the insulation to the floor and I didn't screw anything in, and that was just because I didn't want to waste any space. But also the ridges where the studs theoretically would go were a lot thinner than the studs in the back of the van, so it kind of felt pointless for me to put studs there. It was a lot of back and forth, adjusting, seeing if it fits, going back, seeing if it fits. biggest problem that I came across with these stairs was I got the wrong adhesive. So I got an adhesive that was not meant for insulation, and I forgot that I was using insulation on these stairs because obviously I want a really insulated van. So when I put the insulation on and I stuck it to the insulation, it started eating away at it, which is awesome. It ended up fine, but that is something that I also have learned. So after sticking all of those floor pieces down, I had to make 2 extra pieces. They were just some strips to go on the back of the van and on the edge of the bottom stair, and that was just so that I could eventually drill in some trim. Also, because I was having problems with how even the pine boards were, I just got some Gorilla Tape and just put that on the seams just so that it would just be secure. So after that was all stuck down, pretty much the next step was putting the vinyl down. This is something that I procrastinated forever because I was so anxious about this vinyl. So we did it in 2 sections, which I think ended up being really good. And then after doing that, I was able to easily do the stairs by myself. I think this was the most satisfying part, but it was definitely the most anxiety-inducing part. And it's not perfect by any means, but a lot of it is going to be covered up anyways. The stairs weren't as straightforward, but it was a smaller surface area, so it was a little bit easier for me to deal with. And then I was able to move on doing the hinges, so I was able to screw those hinges on. And I'm pretty sure after doing that, the last step that I had to do was my trimming. And the trimming was a little bit daunting because it was obviously metal. And also the step that I had is obviously not a straight step. I had to make 3 different pieces, and it was just a matter of cutting them to size with a hacksaw. I just had to use some adhesive again and stick it down and also screw it in. I also got my very strong boyfriend to bend that metal piece to kind of shape it to the stairs. So I still have to make a hole in the floor for where some tubing is going to go. I'm obviously in my van right now and you can tell that it's barely ready, but I have been working on the walls, so hopefully I can show you in the next video some walls and some electrical stuff, but for the time being, this is what my floor looks like. I'm pretty proud of it considering I have 0 experience in anything. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I obviously am hoping that there will be more videos in the future. It'll probably take me a lot longer to finish this van just because I am a little bit unwell, but if you're interested in that sort of content, feel free to keep watching. Obviously after all this van stuff is done, I hope to go traveling, but that is so far out of my brain that I'm not even going to think about that. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this van build process. I have a lot of really fun things coming up, and I'm so excited. For the time being, we have a floor done, we have a couple of roof things done, and yeah, we're getting there. So hopefully you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.